Hey guys, so today we are talking about the foundations of our own government, and a lot of that is going to start in the English government. So, first thing that we're going to talk about today is going to be the feudal system, okay? And before we start, I like to talk about government power as something that can be shared and gradually gets shared more between different groups of people. So we might think of it as cake because cake is easily shared between groups of people because it's easy to slice. Okay, so we're talking about political power today and where it gets its start, at least in the English context, and then where it goes to by the time we have the colonists that become revolutionaries that start to plan out their own government. So, talking about the feudal system first, we have essentially a system where the king has sole control of government, right? And this would be one singular cake that the king can decide how they share. They do not have to share it, but they can. And sometimes in the feudal system, sharing this political power, which includes power of the military and power of taxes and manufacturing. So, like if you're going to make something to sell to somebody else, then oftentimes in the feudal system, the king would share some of that power with nobles, with lords. Essentially, this would be giving the lords a slice, okay, of this cake analogy of political power. So the king has some friends, and the king doesn't have to manage the feudal system as much as they would as if they were the sole ruler, right, in this situation. And the lords or the nobility, or sometimes we talk about them as like knights, they're the ones that are going to collect taxes and distribute kind of like the things necessary to live to the regular people in villages living outside of these manors, right? And so regular people, this is a pun, they would kind of have a crummy life, okay? They do get some of what they need in terms of political power, but they are stuck with the crumbs. And oftentimes, these would be people labeled as commoners, okay? Or if you did not own property or have a business that you were providing a service to the kingdom or you were manor lord, then you would be a serf. You'd essentially be a slave or a peasant tied to the land. So, again, it's a kind of crummy life, a dirty life for those serfs and commoners. In a feudal system, all land is owned by the king. And as all land is owned by the king, they have the sole right, which was given by God, to distribute that land or to decide how land is used and worked. The king allows his nobles to use the land, and the king has the nobles use the commoners to work the land. This essentially creates all taxes and everything else that is going to be going to the king, right? So all profit goes straight to the king. And then, if the king chooses, the king can distribute from there. This is essentially the beginnings of our hungry octopus system, mercantilism, right? Back in our class, we talked about the system of empire. Okay. This isn't a system that's kind to anybody but the king, but the people with power to argue against this at this time are going to be the nobles. We're going to talk about the Crusades a little bit. So, during the early 1200s, the king was looking to expand his empire, and they were looking in France. Now, hopefully you remember that war is expensive, right? The king is trying to expand his kingdom, but war is expensive. So what the king does is, without asking his nobles, and this is King John, if you've ever seen Disney Robin Hood, that's the same King John. Without asking his nobles, the king raises taxes. The nobles are mad because they don't get a say, and they're also facing pressure from the commoners who are looking to the nobles to protect them. Okay. So what the nobles are going to do is they are going to rebel. They are going to gather armies, and their armies are essentially going to force the king to give up some of that power. They're going to force him to sign a document that is called the Magna Carta. Okay, and essentially it's the Great Charter, or the Big Letter, the Magna Carta. Okay, this is in 1215 that this is signed. Okay, we just barely had the anniversary of this, like 5 years ago. But the Magna Carta is signed, and the king agrees, kind of at the threat of sword point, right, to share power at least a little. That's the Magna Carta. Okay, the nobles rebel. Against the king's costly wars in France and crusades, and the king agrees that instead of having sole ownership of, like, our political power cake, that the king will divvy it up a little bit and say, okay, I'll put it on your plate, but you are going to get one slice. And this is essentially what he's doing to his nobles, but the king is writing in, as well as the nobles, writing in some things that are going to bind the king, like laws that are written and laws that have everybody's signature involved. This is a binding document at this point. Okay, you're going to flip the page. And if you didn't draw arrows because you're at home, that's totally fine too. One of the things that the Magna Carta sets up is Parliament. And Parliament is essentially an advisory council. That the king will ask permission of if he wanted to raise taxes. Remember that taxes can be raised for a number of different reasons. Maybe there's war, maybe the king wants to build a new fleet of ships to improve the mercantile trade. So permission to raise taxes. Essentially, the king needs a thumbs up from Parliament in order to raise taxes. Okay. Another thing that Parliament is going to do is it is going to seek to improve the relationship between the lords and the nobles and the commoners. Okay, because remember that commoners don't have a lot of representation, so they sometimes complain to the lords that they need more representation. So we're going to take those smaller castles from the lords from the other side, and it is going to split into two representative bodies. There is going to be an upper and a lower house. And if you're in an upper house, then you're nobility, you're probably related to the king already, and you keep all powers that you previously had. But commoners now are going to be able to elect leaders to serve in the lower house of Parliament. We're going to think back to the Virginia House of Burgesses as a lower house of Parliament before it's disbanded by the governor of Virginia. And this is Revolutionary War stuff, but essentially they're going from crumbs to a thin slice of cake, right? You could probably see this slice of cake as with little to no frosting on it, but they are getting more rights. And these are common people over this process. Okay. The next thing we need to talk about is how the common people gain more rights, especially if they're living in England. We're going to go from a thin slice of power to, it's really kind of sad, but a frosted slice of power that really doesn't grow any in size. But at least it has frosting. Okay. We're going to talk about the English Bill of Rights. And a bill is just a list. But before we talk about that, we need to talk about the First English Civil War. Okay. And throughout this story, the king is giving up some power, but he's giving up power to nobility. And there's often three conflicts going on: king and nobility, king and commoner and nobility. So it is during the English Civil War that they have loyalists who are loyal to King Charles, okay? And they are going to be versus parliamentarians. There are people within the upper and lower House of Lords that are going to be choosing factions of how much power the king should have. The king at the time believed that he should have absolute power, okay? And he believed that God had given him this power and he could do with it whatever he wanted to. This would mean taxes without asking Parliament's permission. This would mean pretty much not being able to be checked and balanced by any other living human being other than another king. Sometimes this left countries open to invasion, but it definitely left them open to rebellion. So I'm going to take a moment and doodle absolute power for the king. The king really didn't want to share the power. So in this English Civil War, many of the commoners were going to actually support the parliamentarians, people that sought limits to the king's power. And as they were seeking limits to the king's power, maybe, just maybe, Parliament would share some of that power with the common person. And backing the commoners during the English Civil War was often the members of Parliament that had sought to check the power of the king. There's some religious struggles going on here as well, but they were the big guns in this situation. Parliament that wanted to gain ways to check the power of the king. And as they were doing this, maybe also include some rights for the common person. Okay. One of the ways that they were going to limit the power of the king was with a constitutional monarchy. And the word to look at right here isn't monarchy, which is a single ruler like a king, but it's constitution, binding the power of the king with further written laws. Okay, think back to the Magna Carta. This is an early version of a constitution. Okay, this all results because obviously one king and his loyalist supporters versus a large army of commoners and parliamentarians and artillery, it's pretty quick English Civil War. But this leads to the English Bill of Rights, which, because the commoners helped out the parliamentarians, there's going to be more rights to the commoners. Okay. And there are going to be new additions to the laws that state that this power, these political rights, are not going to come from a king that was chosen by God, Okay, but this political power will come from elections, okay, like the elections to the lower house, and come from the upper house and people that are there to check the power of the king. People that do not say that power is given by God, but power is given by men. And men created political power. That Parliament has the power from then on, not the king. And many of these rights, we'll go over them, but many of these rights are going to be heavily influenced by John Locke. Things such as you should have the ability to have free speech. This has to do with liberty, right? Liberty could include free speech. Or that you should not fear for your life. Or destruction of your property. Remember that the king wanted to take these things away. He threatened life, he threatened liberty if he was unable to raise taxes. Okay, this is a 20-minute video, kind of long, but this is a little bit shorter than we did in class.